No problem. Well,
Take it away, Nathan.
excellent. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Nathan Clough. I'm on the board of the Oakeshott Institute, and I'm the vice president of Arms and Armor. All of this is like part of a kind of funny second life for me, second professional life, until a few years ago I was a college professor teaching political geography and cultural geography. And then, strangely, I was doing a whole bunch of research on the concept of Western civilization and colonialism stuff, and then I saw that sword fighting was happening again, that HEMA existed, and I just immediately tried to make up a reason to be able to do HEMA in terms of academic studies. And I was like, all right, I'm going to study Western civilization as it's expressed in sword fighting. And that lasted for about 2 months. And then I was like, screw it, I'm just going to do sword fighting. And after a couple of years of sword fighting, I discovered that Arms and Armor was in Minneapolis, right next to where I lived. Came down here, started volunteering, became an apprentice at the shop, and then had a whole bunch of discussions with my wife, with several friends. I realized instead of lecturing about political geography, what I really wanted to do was make swords. So I left the university and invested in Arms and Armor. So I bought half the company from my business partner now, Chris Poor, who founded Arms and Armor back in 1982, I think, and trying to bring a new generation on board, reach out to new communities, and continue the really awesome work that folks have been doing here for a long time. So that's me. I've met a bunch of you before. I hope to see many of you in person over the next couple of years as we all get back to travel, get to see all of our sword friends. I'm going to start today by giving you an overview of the Oakeshott Institute, who we are, what we do. Then I'm going to talk about Ewart Oakeshott and how we came to know him, what his kind of program, his life was about, what his typology is for. And then I'm going to make an argument about how his method of thinking about swords is really helpful for us today, doing HEMA, right? Which is something Ewart would have been super excited about, but it was in its relative infancy when he passed away in 2002, and he wasn't really on the internet very much at that point, checking out the new sword stuff in the world. So the Oakeshott Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2000 by Chris Poor, the owner of Arms and Armor, the other owner of Arms and Armor. And the core of what we do is to try and continue Ewart's lifelong passion of putting swords in people's hands. Right? So Ewart Oakeshott, he was an amateur historian. Right? An amateur in the best way, amateur in the kind of tradition of the 19th and early 20th century, where someone who really loved something would dedicate their life to it without it being their actual job. So if you think about, really most of the important people who have written about swords, they were essentially amateurs. Some of them were professional soldiers, but writing and teaching was this, this vocation for them because they loved it. So Ewart had this collection of swords that over his lifetime he had gathered from essentially between the Second World War and the 1980s, mid-80s. He was an illustrator by trade, so his actual job was illustrating in books. But he was super into swords. He went out and he gathered them, and eventually he put together a collection of about 100 swords, mostly, but some daggers, axes, and things like that, that he thought were really important pieces that he really loved. So he wasn't just scavenging up anything. He was trying to find pieces that he thought really exemplified something about European swords, something that could really be educational for everyone and spur a kind of excitement and kind of tactile joy when they were held. And Ewart was never shy about putting his swords in people's hands, right? So one of the swords I'm going to show you today, called Moonbrand, is a super important sword that Ewart named. It wasn't called that before he got it, but he named it that. And he traveled with it a lot. He brought it to the US, he brought it to the continent, and he let people hold it. It's an original sword in beautiful condition from the late 13th century. And it just blew people's minds because up to that point, the only people who really got to handle this stuff were either rich collectors or people who owned ancestral estates or museum curators. And so it was the very wealthy or experts were really able to handle these things primarily. And Ewart just didn't think that was right. He really wanted to kind of democratize knowledge of swords. So in 1985, Chris Poor and Craig Johnson, who's the production manager at Arms and Armor, they were both sword makers, and they had read all of Ewart's books, since the time they were little kids. They had been really interested in swords, and they were selling swords at Renaissance festivals. And the swords they made were okay at that point. There was no high-end sword market at that point in the US, right? The things that you can get today, like Arms and Armor or Albion or stuff that Gus Trim makes, none of that was developed to the kind of level that it is today. Albion didn't exist yet. Gus was still a machinist who was just machining other stuff and whipping out the occasional sword at that point. So they're basically making whatever they could sell to people for a couple $100 at Ren fairs. And they did jousting shows. So they made themselves armor and they rode around and knocked each other off horses at Ren fairs around the country, and then made swords and sold them on the side. But in 1985, they got in contact with this guy down in Kentucky who had a collection of a few antiques. They made friends with him and schmoozed with him a little bit, and they made plans to all go to England and talk to Ewart. So this dude had met Ewart before. At the last minute, the guy from Kentucky backed out of their trip, and Chris and Craig just decided to go anyways. Right? So they basically went, they called, they looked up Ewart's phone number in the phone book, they called him, told him they liked swords and asked if they could come over and meet him. He invited them for tea. They went over to his place, drank tea for several hours, and I was making them tell me the story the other day. And so Chris was sitting there holding Moonbrand in his lap, and Craig was sitting in another chair holding Edward of Woodstock's sword, the Black Prince's sword, in his lap while they were drinking tea. And Ewart, he's a fun old guy wearing tweed. And when about 4 o'clock came around, he was like, "No more tea, let's have some brandy." So they drank some brandy. Over the next several years, Chris and Craig, both of them together and individually, went back and visited Ewart several more times. And eventually, Chris developed a really strong friendship with Ewart and his wife, Sybil. He became kind of like their 6'3", redheaded, bearded American stepson. So much that when they needed repairs on their house, he actually, on 2 different occasions, flew to London and helped them with kind of domestic stuff. Eventually, by the late 90s, Ewart's health was failing. He was quite elderly. And he had been having a bunch of difficulties finding a place, a museum in the UK, that would take his collection and treat it the way he wanted it to be treated. So he wanted his collection to stay together, and he wanted the public to be able to interact with it. He wanted people to be able to touch and hold the swords. And so he was talking to the Wallace collection, he was talking to the Royal Armories, he was talking to museums in Cambridge, and no one would commit to doing it, right? It really kind of flew in the face of curatorial practice. And he was really despairing of this collection being exhibited in the way that he wanted. And so eventually, Chris, Ewart, and David Edge, who you may have heard of, he was the curator of the Wallace collection for a very long time until just recently, he just retired. We're all sitting around drinking brandy again. And, you know, David was like, what if you sent the swords to America? Right? Maybe there you could have this kind of setup. And they came up with the idea of the Oakeshott Institute. Then and there, and over the next couple of years, they developed a contract, started this nonprofit foundation. Ewart and his wife Sybil loaned their collection to the Oakeshott Institute for 99 years on the condition that it be available for people who were interested to handle it. And so that's the mission that we've been trying to carry out in our limited way. The swords have gone to various exhibitions, tried to bring them around to various events. We're mostly hampered by small amounts of funding. But we like to think that we're trying to live up to Ewart's ideals. So the items that came over, there were about 75 items eventually that we got. Certain other items went to various collections in the UK, like the Black Prince sword, it having belonged probably to British royalty, decided it should probably stay in England. So that sword is at the Worshipful Company of Armourers in London. Several others went to various other collections and collectors in the last year of Ewart's life. So, but the core of the collection is here in Minneapolis. That relationship between us and David Edge also grew. We ended up having a bunch of collaborations with the Wallace collection, so that David took latex molds of a bunch of the items in the Wallace collection, mailed them to us so that we could reproduce those weapons for various BBC specials and exhibitions that they were doing and stuff. And we made an agreement with them that items that he cast, we could produce. So our Burgundian poleaxe, our Wallace, or our Bollock dagger set, our Warhammer, a whole bunch of items, the Gothic mace, are all made from molds that David Edge took of the originals in the Wallace collection. So we reproduced them. So Arms and Armor and the Oakeshott Institute today have this kind of symbiotic relationship. They're in the same building. We just fancied up one wall of the Oakeshott Institute room, so it looks really fancy, but the other walls are cement. Arms and Armor is right next door, and Arms and Armor essentially does about 85% of the financial support of the Oakeshott Institute. The rest comes from various donations and events that we do. So that's kind of how we got connected and why we have this collection in Minneapolis of these swords. So real quick, are there any questions or clarifications that anyone has about this first explanations? If you have one, you can just unmute and ask.
Later, if you have a chance, just a little note, it'd be good to get the links for those BBC specials. It'd be nice to see which ones those contributed to, just to watch those later. If you could share that later, that'd be awesome.
Sure, I'll have to dig them up. But if you remind me afterwards, I'll be sure to look them up. Cool.
Quick question.
Sure.
What's going to happen at the end of the 99 years?
Well, at that point, in the contract, they're supposed to revert to Ewart's heirs. But it's quite confusing right now who actually that might be. Sybil, his wife, died soon after he did, and actually their child, Prunella, passed away soon thereafter, and her son tragically died after that. So it's unclear what's going to happen at this point, it's like 82 years or something. But someone will have to figure it out at that point.
You're like, maybe
But yeah, it's a good
maybe not me.
So at this point, I want to talk about Ewart's work a little bit. He's most famous for his typology. Right? So Ewart was studying these European medieval swords at a time when the dominant understanding of what they were like was essentially this idea that had come through the Victorians. People like Hutton and Edgerton Castle, right? These guys who really had limited knowledge and a kind of a cultural agenda at the time, right? So from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment and the early part of the 20th century, there's this kind of push in European intellectual history to try and understand whatever the present was for them as the apex of human development. There's all kinds of stuff related to this. But in terms of swords and sword fighting, the argument was basically that everything that happened before the Renaissance was nasty and brutish and irrational. And then, man read the Greeks and developed reason again, and Britain led the world into the future. And so they were highly motivated to think about these swords and fighting systems of the past as essentially irrational and brutish. And you can see this when you read these Victorian authors, right? They describe medieval combat as essentially brutes dressed in armor so heavy they couldn't move, swinging gigantic swords at each other, and it was simply a contest of who was the strongest. It's stuff that, as HEMA practitioners, we know is totally false. Totally false. But there wasn't a lot of information about how people actually fought, and this was the dominant idea about how swords were. And Ewart, being an aficionado of these, who had gone out and handled hundreds and hundreds of originals over the course of many decades, was really motivated to try and tell people, look, these are elegant. They're light, they're fast, they're not irrational. Right? These weapons have to be understood as part of their time, but they also have to be understood physically. That you should hold them and see it will dispel so many myths. You actually pick up a sword. And so we all see this happen all the time, I'm sure, when you meet a friend who hears you do sword fighting and you put a sword in their hand, they're like, whoa, this isn't as heavy as I thought, or wow, you guys, this looks way different than I thought it would, right, based on popular culture, right? So that's what Ewart was doing. He was really kind of myth busting the cultural context of swords at that time period. And he had a couple of theses, right? A couple of arguments that he had eventually developed to try and understand swords. And so the first one was that swords have to be understood in context, in a honest intellectual framework of the society and the time and the place that they came from, rather than being compared to some kind of thing in another time and place. Right? Try and understand it in its context. 2, understand it as a tool. Right? Understand it as something that's to be used and that was rationally produced to achieve a goal. And so these swords, they're not stupid. Right? They're made the way they were by people who were just as smart as us, who have thought about sword fighting more than us, because their lives actually depend on it. And 3, to really understand it, you can't just look at pictures, you can't just look at it through glass. You have to hold it, and it really helps if you have some experience in trying to use it in a historical way. So Ewart would be super excited at the ways that HEMA is reconstructing these fighting techniques. He'd think it was awesome that we were doing this. Right? So these arguments, these theses, Ewart developed over the first 20 years, essentially, of his research, of going out, schmoozing his way into museums and private collections, going to auctions, and handling these swords. And they blew his mind. These things were not at all what he expected. His typology, which is his most famous contribution, was a system that he developed through this process of getting to know swords to help him describe them and to help him compare them. Right? So a typology is a kind of artificial framework. Right? He's looking at thousands of swords, most of which have very poor provenance. People don't know exactly when they were made or where. It may not even be clear where they were found. Some of them have been taken apart and put back together. Some of them may have been used for 150 or 200 years from the time they were made, being resharpened, remade, rehilted during this process. And so, you couldn't just date a sword. You couldn't tell where it came from because there's this massive trade. So he said, all right, let's look at all of their characteristics. Let's look at the blade shape, the cross, the grip if it exists, the tang, the pommel, and we'll try and figure out if we can make some kind of groups that make sense. Right? So he wasn't trying to argue about the evolution of swords. Sometimes he made arguments about the evolution of swords, but the typology, it's not an evolutionary tree about the development of swords. I always say swords don't mate, so they don't evolve in that kind of way. Instead, he's looking at how they work and what forms they take and trying to make broad categories. Some of these categories only existed for small periods of time in relatively unique geographic places. Some of them existed for vast swaths of history, or, certain kinds of swords were very popular for 100 years in the 11th century and then disappeared for 250 years and then show up again later on. And the way to understand why and how is through the context of what was happening. So his typology begins with type 10 because Jan Petersen had already made a typology of Viking swords, which actually went to 8, and Oakeshott made types 9 and 10 to describe Viking swords. But Petersen pretty much was just interested in hilts. In part, that was because most Viking swords had blades that were very similar to each other. In other ways, it was because he was highly influenced by art history, which really was interested in the hilt as a piece of art instead of the sword as a weapon. So Ewart starts with type 10, he goes up to type 22. The first 4 types, type 10 through 14, are swords that he thought could be grouped together in what he called Group 1, which was swords from the period when defensive armor was mostly chain mail. Swords from type 15 through 22, he said, were swords from the period when plate armor predominated. And his supposition was that the nature of the defenses that were worn influenced the design of the swords, and that swords that were used during the period when chainmail prevailed were largely cutting swords without a very pointy tip, spatulate point, wide blades that cut well, and plate armor swords tended to be more rigid and to have a sharper point. I think there are reasons to question those assumptions based on what we know about swords and sword fighting today, but this is the basic schema that he laid out. So I'm going to put on some gloves here and show you a sword. Actually, two swords to begin with, to cover our early history. So the first one is actually prehistoric. And it is a Bronze Age sword from Northern Europe, probably Germany-ish, that dates to about 1500 BC. So this sword is 3,500 years old.
How is it in such good shape?
Bronze, right? Bronze is amazing. It doesn't corrode. It's in fantastic condition. Can you see the design on there? The etching?
Oh my God, that's insane.
Yeah,
How would they have done the etching? With acid or?
by hand. So they would have
Wow.
used something harder than the bronze.
I've seen a similar design on a Celtic horn from Britain, I think.
Sure.
That same sort of weaving with the dots.
Yeah, and these are very common across a bunch of different cultures during the Bronze Age, these kinds of organic designs. We really don't know what they mean. But yeah, they're like a bunch of Celtic stuff, early Celtic stuff, like Latene period. Early stuff has these same kinds of designs. On the blade, let's see if you can see, there is some incising along the edge, all hand done. What you'll notice looking at this is that it's very thick. And so this sword might be the heaviest sword I'm going to show you today. And that's strictly based on material science.
Bronze is super soft, right?
It's quite soft, right? Bronze, but more than being soft, it doesn't have the capacity to be a spring. So if you deform bronze, it stays deformed. It won't spring back like steel. Right? So in order to keep it functional, you need a thick section that will prevent it from bending in the first place. Bronze actually hardens when you hammer it. And so that's one of the reasons these are leaf-shaped, like hobbit blades, right? There was really no reason ever to make an iron or steel sword that's that shape, but there's a very strong reason to make bronze swords that shape, right? Because down here, it's not even sharp, doesn't have to be. But up here, to get it down to an edge, you start with this thick section and you hammer it out cold to get this finer edge. And so you tend to get a shape, essentially, that will leaf more or less naturally. It also became a cultural symbol. These things are really interesting. So you can see the hilt. This sword is actually one piece of bronze, but you can see these, what look like rivets here. So slightly earlier pieces than this were two pieces. They were a cast hilt and then a cast and hammered blade that were actually held together by rivets. But that form apparently was so important across all of these cultures that when they eventually started making it one piece, they made it look like it was two pieces, which is this kind of fascinating cultural thing. We have no idea why, what it meant, right? But that's what they did. And so this sword is the ancestor, right, of all of these things. So this one, if a Trojan War happened, this is from that time. Different place, further north, but same kind of technology, right? It's a fascinating piece. This is a Viking sword, right? Very different shape. You can see that the edges are parallel, right down to this kind of spatulate point. The hilt on this is, Ewart had it reconstructed. It's not original to it. In fact, the tang was corroded off. He had a little more tang welded on and then added this so that people could feel it and hold it. But the blade was a river find. If I get it just right, can you see these swirly shapes in the fuller? That is pattern building.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah. So when these were made, steel was super expensive. Iron was quite expensive. And these were high prestige weapons. So this sword probably dates to around the year 900 AD. You would make this center fuller by essentially braiding iron wires. Now, this is super labor intensive because wire is really hard to make if you don't have a machine. You have to draw pieces of iron through smaller and smaller holes to get wires, and then you braid it together, and then you forge it into a core of the blade. And then steel, which you've produced very small amounts of, right? When you make bloomery iron, right? You take this iron ore essentially and cook it down, you get a bunch of cast iron, which has really high carbon content. So if you take your cast iron pan and smash it on the sidewalk, it's going to shatter. Right? That has more carbon than steel does. You'll get a little bit of steel, which is iron with, you know, between 0.5 and 1% carbon essentially, and you'll get a decent amount of ductile or hog iron. So you get more iron than steel, so steel's more expensive. So you take this core and then you forge weld a strip of steel around the edge. Now, does this remind anyone of another kind of famous sword making? This iron core and a steel edge. It's kind of the famous Japanese style of making blades. Both of them made them like this for the same reason. It's because they had shitty access to steel, right? So the iron sands in Japan, it's hard to make good quality steel. So the best steel was super expensive. One way you can use less steel while still making a really good sword is to use a soft iron core and a hard iron edge, or a hard steel edge. And that's what the Vikings were doing too. But then you develop all of this mythology and aesthetics around that. They make beautiful swords. So the reason they were probably braiding this was that you could see it. It was beautiful, right? The Vikings were not modest wallflowers. These Nordic peoples, they loved the beauty of these. So if you read the sagas, they talk about a flame blade or a snake blade, right? It was probably, they're referring to the pattern welding in the fuller on those, which you can see under certain light conditions when it's highly polished. And it was a sign of a high quality sword. Right? So one thing you'll notice about this is that this sword is 1.5 millimeters thick in the last foot. It's utterly different than the Bronze Age sword. Right? I'm not going to flex it because it's 1,000 years old, but it is flexible. Right? It's an enormous change from these older swords. The invention of steel, swords can flex, right? So the Romans were using iron and steel as well, right? The Vikings didn't invent it. In fact, they were probably getting some of their steel from Syria, from India, that they were using on the edges of these, right? But an excellent example of a Viking period sword. So this one this pommel, I think it's like a type 8 or something like that. I don't have the Peterson's typology memorized. Also, there's no reason to memorize typologies. That's why we have books. So, Ewart's trying to bust these myths. He's trying to teach people what these swords were really like, and he gives us this method for understanding swords. And so at Ren Fair last year, selling swords, not this past year, last year it happened, this guy comes up to me with a big horn full of mead, and I was showing him one of our Viking swords, and he's like, real Viking swords weigh 80 pounds.
Okay.
He was like, I went to a place in Nova Scotia, and they weighed 80 pounds. It's like, dude, the sword's accurate. They weigh 2 pounds. But believe what you have to think the Vikings were awesome. They were awesome with 2-pound swords. 80-pound swords are ridiculous.
What Renaissance Festival are you guys at?
The Minnesota Festival and the Bristol Festival, which is outside Chicago. So we do those. We used to do a lot more, but then the internet got invented, which meant that you didn't have to go to all the Renaissance festivals. It's awesome. So, if we apply Ewart's methodology to today's context, what can it teach us? Well, popular culture is still full of a ton of misconceptions about medieval swords. And these are propagated in different ways than they were during the Victorian period in the early 20th century. One of these is through fantasy literature and video games, right, which some fantasy literature is pretty accurate. A lot of it, for no reason, is wildly inaccurate about what swords are like. Some of it is influenced by Hollywood, right? Like Conan's sword, right? The famous story that it weighs, like 14 pounds, something like that, because that is what Arnold wanted, so that he flexed appropriately when he was holding it. So he wanted it to make him look super badass.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah,
As
exactly.
a bodybuilder, I mean, as a bodybuilder, you would know which angles to show off. I get it. Okay.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, he wanted the
I get it.
So we get this idea through that kind of thing. And in video games, when swords are shown really, really big and really thick, which is partially aesthetic and it's partially because if something is 1.5 millimeters thick, you can't see it in profile. And if you can't see it, you can't video game it very well. So they make things bigger so that you can see them. But it develops this kind of cultural idea that these things are really, really big, really, really heavy. Then we have things like Forged in Fire and what's the other one? Knife or Death, is that what it's called? These shows that are about destroying swords, right, are currently kind of the bane of our existence. I'm not going to go off on them too much. They're good TV, they're fun, but the whole point is to break swords and then evaluate if something's a good sword or not based on whether or not it broke when you did things with it that you should never do with a sword, right? So these develop interesting expectations and ideas in society. And so I was talking to RJ McKeon out in LA when he was on one of these shows. And so he had a sword made because he knew that the competition was going to be things like chop this giant block of ice into pieces, chop that log in half, use this sword to climb a giant wall, and then break cement blocks with it. And we'll see what happens, right? So he commissioned it, and they made a sword that worked really well for that. But it has almost nothing in common with real medieval swords, which were never intended for that kind of usage, right? I tell people, think of a sword as a chef knife, right? If you spend $250 on a chef knife, can you cut down a tree with it? Probably, maybe, right? Are you going to ruin it? Absolutely. Because it's not for slaying trees. It's for cutting sushi. And so swords are in a similar kind of position. Another area where swords are really understood is in academic studies, especially in art history and literature to this day. They're deeply misunderstood. In part, it's getting somewhat better with quality reproductions. But I was recently reading a catalog from a brilliant museum exhibition in the Netherlands that made claims about the swords in it that were just clearly plain wrong. Right? They were like, this sword that has a rounded point would be useless for stabbing, therefore it can only be used for slashing. Right? Which is just wrong. You can totally stab with a sword like a Viking sword that has a rounded point because the blade's only 1 millimeter thick right there and it's sharp. It's going to go through things like butter. Right? But there are these ideas that are still perpetuated that they're simply a result of people not having handled these things and not thinking that tactile experience is valuable. Finally, we have a new kind of area in popular culture that can perhaps teach us a bunch of things, but could also lead us astray. And that's what we all do. That's HEMA, right? One of the interesting phenomena that's going on is a whole bunch of people who are really into historical sword fighting and learning historical techniques. Their first and most of their experience with sword fighting is with fetters, right? Which are a 16th century innovation to allow a certain kind of sword fighting play to be relatively safe. And we're not even reproducing those exactly. We're making them way safer and way stiffer than those originals were. So as sword makers, we often find that people call us and they're like, I want a sharp sword that's exactly like my fetter. It's like, all right, we could, but that's a terrible idea, right? Your fetter is already a kind of crummy simulation of a sharp sword. We don't want to make a simulation of that, right? We want to make what your fetter is supposed to be simulating to use. So that's a thing that Ewart's methodology can help us understand too, right? The way that our experience as sword fighters using a particular kind of simulated weapon in our practice influences our ideas about what swords are like. Now, how do fetters trick us into thinking we know about swords when maybe we don't? Well, most modern fetters have a grip that's significantly longer than most of the medieval swords that were being used in the time periods that we're looking at. Not all. There were some swords with long grips then too, but they were a minority, and they were strange swords. So most fetters have grips that are longer than historical longswords had. Many fetters are longer than historical longswords were. And some of them are actually more rigid than a bunch of historical swords were. Some of them are more flexible than historical swords were. Right? And when we thrust or hit someone, we think we know what it's like to hit them or thrust them with a sword, but it's a very different experience to actually thrust into something that's forgiving rather than it bouncing off of someone. So the swords I want to show you today are some that I've selected that I think have attributes that are counterintuitive to HEMA practitioners today. And so these are swords that are mostly not diamond cross-section. Right? So most reproduction swords that we use have a diamond cross-section. So if you look at it from the point, right, the blade is shaped like a diamond, and they're quite rigid. So most of these swords are actually hexagonally sectioned swords, which were very common. I think that some of these swords also challenge Ewart's ideas about what they were used for in relation to chainmail and plate armor. So I'm going to pull up a few of these, and if you can't see it very well the way I'm holding it, say something. I'll try and readjust. If you want me to show you a particular part of the blade, speak up. I'm happy to. If you have any questions, just speak up while we're looking at these.
I have a question really quickly.
Yeah.
The Towton longsword
Yep.
has a much shorter blade. Is that a more standard length of a longsword than what we see with fetters and other longswords?
The Towton is a very kind of average longsword from its period. So yes, but there was a bunch of variation in longswords as well. I think sometimes as HEMA fighters, since longswords are the first thing that we've really had information on and that we're really fighting with, we kind of tend to think of all swords as being similar to longswords, which there's a lot of variation between them. But yeah, the Towton's a good example of a kind of average length longsword. And when we made that one, our goal was to produce a longsword that would have been something that, a knight or a man-at-arms of 15th century, if he picked it up, he wouldn't think twice. And so it'd be a normal sword for that kind of use. Yeah. So this first sword, this one Ewart had regripped. The grip is not original, and the cross is not original. The pommel and the blade are. And this sword dates from the 12th century, and it appears to have been on crusade. The reason we think it was on crusade, let's see, I'm going to hold it up here. You see some etching or inscribing in here. So here's an arch.
Mm-hmm.
Come up.
Nathan,
Yep.
to
Maybe
interrupt,
like a
do you want me to
sun.
toss up the models of these in the
Oh,
chat?
I was gonna do, yeah. If you want to link them up, that'd be awesome. Then
Okay, because I don't think you actually have the link to this one, but I have the model of it, so I'll throw it
fantastic.
up in chat.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Dale. So Dale, who was just speaking, made the 3D models of these things. Right. So it has several crosses in it, and we think that this represents the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, with the door and then the crosses. It has on the other side, boy, the light isn't awesome. Here you can see what looks like a flower. It's probably actually a Greek cross on there. And the last cool thing, which you'll be able to see on Dale's model much better, is, I don't know if you can see the finger. There's a hand pointing on the end of the sword, which is essentially, oh, I wonder you couldn't see it. There it is. That's pointing toward the tip, which appears to be the hand of God or something, pointing, I will smite you. The interesting thing about this sword, right, is that it's from a period when chainmail was prevalent. Right? Mail was the main kind of armor. And this sword is very thin. It is hexagonal sections, so it is flat and then tapers down to the edges, which was a very common geometry for these swords. The tip is about a little over 1 millimeter thick out here. It would not fare super well against chain armor. Right? You couldn't thrust through chain with this. You could thrust someone who wasn't wearing chain really readily. This would go straight through cloth armor, right? And flesh, depending on the cloth armor charms. Right, so what's it tell us? Well, this sword probably wasn't for killing people in chain armor, right? Like most swords, it was probably a sidearm that was great for killing other people who weren't knights, right? Who weren't armored. So if you're armored, you're mounted, this thing is a fillet knife that's utterly vicious for killing people who aren't armored. Right? If you're fighting other people who are armored, you probably have a spear, right? You have a lance, something that's great for stabbing people who are in armor. Not that you couldn't use this if you had to, right? But it's frankly, it's not that dangerous to someone who's wearing a full habergeon, right? Unless you get them at their throat or at some kind of gap, but it's not for penetrating this kind of stuff. And so when Ewart tells us that these are for defeating chain armor, maybe, maybe not, right? They're certainly from the period of chain armor, but they don't actually seem optimized for fighting people in chain. And these are my thoughts. I could be wrong about some of this for sure, and I'm open to other explanations. Right?
So one thing I've been interested in about, at least, is kind of the class notions. So like if I'm fighting someone who's rich enough to afford a habergeon, do I want to kill them or do I want to capture them? Right. And so, right. So like the assumption that we necessarily want to kill someone in armor, I think I think a lot of people make assumptions about that don't necessarily hold out when we think about kind of the financial incentives and kind of recorded accounts of what people or how they acted towards each other, like towards those of equal rank.
Sure. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that's one of the reasons to wear fancy armor, so everyone can tell you're rich and it's better to ransom you than to kill you.
Yeah.
On the field. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Although this might not even be super good at subduing.
Yeah.
But an interesting example.
Mhm.
The next,
How much material would be lost due to corrosion, and it's sitting completely uncared for in the dirt?
it's hard to say, right? So, yeah, it's really difficult to say. The thing that makes us think that not tons is that the etching exists still. Right? So if it lost lots of material,
Mhm.
we probably wouldn't be able to make out the surface detail that was put on it. So
Okay.
yep, and you can see areas where essentially it's more damaged
Mhm.
from corrosion, and there are areas where it's less. So this surface here, the smooth.
Oh, I see. You could just replicate from there.
Exactly. So that appears to be the original surface.
Okay.
And Dale's model that he's linking to, his models are incredible. And you can zoom in to very small detail and look at this and move it all around. The next sword is Moonbrand that Ewart named. He thought it was just the most iconic Type 14 knightly sword. It is also super thin. How thin is the point of this, Dale? Do you remember from your model?
Yeah. So at the point at which I measured, I think it goes down to 1.2 millimeters, 1.3, and it actually is slightly fullered there. It's really hard to tell, but all the way down to the tip, it's like fullered
Oh yeah.
like 1/10 of a millimeter. It's absolutely remarkable.
So
What
it's like a
the heck?
piece of paper out here at the point of this sword. You can see that it has 4 fullers here. The blade is 3 fingers wide on me. The grip is original. And this pommel is massive. It's quite hefty. This sword, when Ewart collected it, had this whole history in the kind of mid-20th century competition of sword buying where it came up to auction and somebody didn't want it because it had a little nick in the point, and then it went to Sotheby's, and then it came around, and finally Ewart got it, and he carried it with him all over the place. Eventually it actually broke here when he dropped it off a trolley or something in New York, and then he had it repaired.
John's face was like,
I know.
why?
And so this peening block, we're unsure if it's actually original or if it was added when they welded the tang back together and put it through. It's hard to say. We're not sure. Ewart didn't really keep the record of that. You can see it, there's still leather on the grip, even though this was a river find. He had it cleaned by electrolysis, so it was super corroded. Then running a current thread allowed that to pop off. Yeah, so he thought it was the most iconic sword. And if you hold this thing, it's amazing. I think it just breaks so many of our ideas of what a sword from this period should feel like. This super thin blade, which is, again, it's a fillet knife. Right? Feels nothing like the vast majority of swords that we see reproduced, which are primarily these diamond section swords. Now, diamond section swords existed. Don't get me wrong. There were lots of them. There are lots of good reproductions of them. We had these very thin ones too. I think that one of the reasons we don't see a lot of reproductions of these types of swords is essentially the crummy Toledo reproductions from the 70s through the 90s that were mostly just a piece of thin steel that then they beveled on the edges. Kind of made us all think that these flat hexagonal section swords were cheap and not real. When really this thing goes from maybe 3 millimeters thick at the cross, tapers down, a little over 1. It's still kind of dangerously sharp, actually, when you handle it.
Is there a design on the wheel of the pommel?
The pommel,
Or is that just pitting from corrosion?
it's just corrosion,
Okay.
I believe. Dale, do you know from doing the close-up photography?
Yeah, so there's actually asymmetric corrosion on the sword, which I think Craig and I are speculating means that one face was in the mud and the other face was maybe exposed to the water for slightly longer. Because you'll notice there's a higher presence of large-sized pits on one side, and on the other side, and also on one side, you have kind of these vein-like patterns in the pommel and on the
Mhm.
crossguard.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at.
It's super obvious if you look at it on the model.
Yeah.
But
I see.
yeah, it is definitely slightly asymmetric.
Fascinating sword. So this model of this one, we've just put up. You guys put it up yesterday, right, Dale?
Yeah, yesterday or the day before.
Yeah. So this 3D model is, I think, one of the coolest ones yet that we've done. So we'll link that so that you can check it out in, millimeter detail, high definition after this.
Hmm. I have all of these up, so I'll be like putting them in the Facebook event and emailing this out to everyone so they can take a peek.
Fantastic. This next sword, we also have a model of. And so this is probably Italian, probably from 1490s, something like that, late 15th century, which puts it right into the time period of a bunch of exciting HEMA sword fighting stuff, right? Oh, Italian from the late 15th century, awesome. And do some Marozzo. I think it's actually pretty nice sword for Bolognese style work. And actually, this is the next, you guys are the first people to hear it, but this is the next sword that we're reproducing in Arms and Armor. So we have taken molds of the pommel and the cross, reproducing that, and right now we're just dialing in the blade geometry on this thing to reproduce it. It has this big globose pommel with something like acanthus or lotus patterns on it. You see this little peen down at the bottom of the pommel, which is quite characteristic of a lot of these. The peen is often significantly less than 1/4 of an inch, sometimes closer to 1/8 in diameter. So the tangs go from pretty much full thickness up here, and they get much thinner right at the pommel. And as they come through the pommel, they taper really significantly on many of these. So this little peen is historical on many swords. Some were much bigger, but these little ones were quite popular increasingly as we go forward in time. Grip, not original, probably. And someone wrapped it in silk thread at some point, probably Victorian. Right here, it says 1800 on it. That's not when it was made. It's a museum catalog number. The Victorians loved doing things like that. Like, oh, we have this sword, it's number 1800. Bam, 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 bam. And put a number on it. See here, 3 fullers, quite short in the ricasso. Central fuller extends out about 8-9 inches right here. And the geometry changes from square or rectangular to hexagonal here. And the hexagonal section carries all the way out to the point. This section, this sword too, thin and flexible. It's in wonderful condition. So I'm a little less scared to bend it. This one too, under 2 millimeters thick, out here at the point, spatulate end. This sword, boy, I'm not sure how much it weighs. Oh, I have a scale.
It's 2.83 pounds when I weighed it.
It's about right. Yeah, 2.83. And it feels fantastic in the hand. One of the most interesting things about this is a fairly early complex hilt. And so 1490s, we start to see this development, especially in Italy, right, leading to more protection of the hand, which eventually evolves into rapiers, basket hilts, all that kind of stuff. And, no knuckle guard yet on this one, although it's not much later that we start to see this stuff really occurring. Here at the ends, you can see more of the decoration on the cross, which tells us, right, all this decoration, that this sword was meant to be seen. Right? So we're kind of going back in some ways to the, this Viking period stuff where your sword is jewelry, right? It's a status display. You're wearing it, possibly as a civilian, right? Not just a military weapon that you're wearing fairly frequently as part of your dress. For longsword lovers, here's a longsword. Right, so this is one that Ewart collected, I think in the 60s. It came out of Erbach Palace, probably in Germany. And if you've seen any British period dramas about the early 20th century, right, you know that these big estates were financially in rough shape, right? Downton Abbey, interwar period, these estates are broke. And many of them still have their arsenals, or a lot of their arsenals. And so the landlords, the lords of these places, started selling off their weapons as a way to raise funds. And so we think that that's what happened with this one. It's in excellent condition. It's one reason to think that it was in the armory for a long time and taken care of, right? It may well have just been on the wall. This sword is probably from early 16th century. And you can see that the grip is original on it. It's wood with leather wrapped around it. Looks like there's cord underneath the leather. It's all still pretty solid. The cross has a little movement in it, and that's because this whole thing was compression fitted, right? So if you look at cheaper sword reproductions or sword reproductions from the 80s, a lot of them would braze the cross onto the blade as a way to make it sturdy, which is a knife making technique. People didn't know how to make swords, so they just made big knives. Instead, here we see that what holds this firmly against the blade is the compression of the grip. Right? So you slide this on over the tang, put the grip on, put the pommel on, you peen it, and that holds it all tight, which is how most high quality sword reproductions are made today, in this kind of similar way.
Looks like there's a small cross on the other side of the blade. Is
Yep.
that a maker's mark?
Yep, we think so. Dale, do you have anything to add about the marks?
No, except that it's kind of curious that they're asymmetric instead of being equal-sided. It has a longer. I mean, we're assuming that's the bottom, but I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. So, and this kind of branching cross symbol, I think, was fairly common as a mark for quite a while. So it's not something that we were able to nail down and say, oh, that's clearly this in that town. Right? This one, diamond section, right? It's a long sword. Maybe see it from the end. So you can see the ridge up the point. It's the only time you want to see a sharp longsword pointing at you like that, right? So this sword is very similar to the kind of thing that we study in HEMA that should be used, right? This grip, though, is substantially shorter than the vast majority of training swords that we use today. So this grip is 7 inches. something like that. Quite
Everybody
short.
measure your long swords.
So I'm not going to hold it by the grip because it's 500 years old. I'm going to put my hand on there. You can see that my top hand takes up half the grip. Right? My second hand can't even fit without being partially on the pommel.
So it's amazing for fencing. This is one of the perks is I took my scan and gave all the measurements to the guys at ANA and had them replicated exactly for my sword in which I trained with.
Yeah.
And it completely changed the way that I fence. Also, like, it means that my hands are tight together when I'm actually holding the sword.
Mhm.
I don't get this nice long grip that I see a lot of my students end up actually doing.
Mm-hmm.
How does that change how you fence?
My hands are looser. Also, the direction of the spiral in the pommel makes it so that when I just have my fingers in any of the hanging guards, I actually have a lot better register on what my edge alignment is. And also with the extreme swelling in the waist here, I don't know, I didn't understand how important having good risers were until we had this swell in the middle. Just having a straight grip with risers isn't quite as good as having this almost cork stopping my hand from sliding backwards.
Mhm.
And then this super thin transition to the pommel.
Yeah, it's probably 3/4 of an inch, maybe.
Yeah, where I can completely lock my fingers around it if I want to, or I can be completely loose. So,
Which kind of makes Wallerstein's weird pommel grips a little more sensical, as opposed to like, why would you do this really long reverse grip? If it's small like that, like it took you what, 2 seconds to just turn? Yeah.
Like everything happens super fast when you have a really short grip.
And so
doesn't Arms and Armor, they make a Schloss Airbach reproduction based on that?
yes, we do. And so we've made it, that one actually, we took a latex mold of the pommel as well and then recreated the cross on it. So we reproduced that one really in a very close reproduction, which is kind of nice. Like with Dale's trainer like that, it's one of the things I always talk about with people. Like, it's so awesome if you can train to fight with the sword you would actually fight with, right? Clearly you can't fence people with a sharp sword. You'll run out of friends so fast, right? If you're not careful. Well, it's dangerous, right? Maybe Roland can do it, whatever. But having that same grip, right, makes you fight like you would fight with that sword. The downside is, Dale, can you fit big heavy gloves in there?
Oh God, no. I actually, I can't remember which gloves I was trying to fence with, but I literally can't fit my second hand on. I can get 2 fingers.
Yeah.
So I stopped fencing with heavy gloves on.
Yeah, exactly, right? So it's one of those moments where Ewart's methodology can help us understand swords, right? So the context that we're trying to relearn sword fighting in, our safety equipment, biases our understanding, and it biases the swords, the fetters, right? So fetters have gotten longer and longer and longer and longer grips, even just over the last 5 years with all these makers, because it's way more comfortable if you're wearing all this giant gear and these big gloves, because you're fighting people that you don't know and don't trust, who aren't very good, who will break your hands if you don't. Right? So you have to, but we have to be careful what inferences we draw back about what swords were like and how they were used from those instruments. We can learn lots of stuff, but we have to keep in mind what we can't learn from it as well. Next. This is actually, I think, the heaviest sword that I have here.
No.
Ooh. There's
I would,
It is very long.
yeah, it's a super long rapier. Right, so this is, early 17th century, right? Kind of classic rapier. You start to get these things super long, beautiful hand piercing work in the shields. These faceted pommel, fingers clearly go up over the ricasso. Something to look at here is the ricasso on this blade is the thickest piece of steel on any of the swords in here. The only thing that's thicker than it is the bronze sword. It is massively thick. This has a diamond section, a thick diamond section. The entire blade, because this sword needs to be pretty rigid. And it is relatively rigid. You can still bend it. It's not wildly more rigid than many training rapiers, right? But what makes it deadly instead of safe is that it's sharp instead of blunt. So this sword was built for a totally different context. Right? This one, you can cut with a rapier if you're good. I recently just shared on our blog a video of Phil Martin from Aikidoka in Arizona cutting with our, I think it was our 3-wing ring rapier, cutting tatami with a rapier, which is pretty awesome. He's very good, but you have to do it perfectly. And it's not really for that, right? Would you cut with these? Maybe sometimes. Cut to the throat, right? Cut to the scalp to make them bleed. But it's really, it's a dedicated weapon for thrusting, right? So this kind of diamond section absolutely exists, absolutely important, but only within particular contexts, right? These kinds of specialized in this context here. Other complex hilted swords.
Where's the balance on that rapier with it being so long?
2.5 inches maybe from ricasso, so that's maybe 4 or 5 inches from the cross. So this pommel's actually pretty massive, and the blade tapers really significantly. So it thins pretty consistently over the length of the blade, which pulls that balance nice. It actually, despite being a pretty, substantial sword, it feels great. It moves really nicely. I'm not sure I want to stand there with my arm straight out for a long time. But.
Right.
Nathan, that's the one you brought to Longpoint a couple years ago?
Nope, not this one. So the one from, I think I brought the 7-ring rapier.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yep. Which is a little bit shorter than this one.
Yeah.
But has a same period. Yeah. Or maybe anyways. There's several really awesome rapiers. So.
Yeah, the shame of this class is we're doing this online and you don't get to handle them like we did a couple years ago. But the bottom line is those points of balance are exactly where they have to be. And if you ever get the chance to do an event like that again, where you get to handle these weapons, that is the sickest thing in the world, to hold that rapier and know how a killing machine feels in your hand. It's insane.
Oh, totally.
What's the point of rotation on that sword?
Yeah, it's kind of out here.
So let me clarify. I guess I mean when you hold it at the cross and swing. Yeah, that point of rotation. Is it at the tip or at the mid blade?
It is midway.
Nice. I remember hearing that about rapiers, that long swords rotate at the tip, rapiers rotate mid-blade. Is that, in your experience, true?
I don't know. It's not something that I've tried before. Do you have any idea?
It's, at least for the ones in the collection, it really varies. Like the Schloss isn't quite out to the tip. One thing that is really interesting is how far back, like Moon Brands is.
Yeah.
You would think, just with the overall geometry, that would be slightly different, but that thing, it moves.
Interesting. Way far from the tip. Yeah.
Because that's one of the statements I've heard about how long swords and how most fetters I like or I've handled tend to rotate at the tip, and it's one of the arguments for why there's more footwork in longsword than there is in rapier work, Because with longsword, you rotate around your sword. With rapier, you rotate the rapier point. You move it differently because its point of rotation isn't at the tip, where long swords are at the tip.
It could be. I mean, and it's one of those things, like, it's one of those interesting things about like Peter's work, Peter Johnson. So in book Das Schwert, Form and whatever, where he's laying out his kind of physics of long swords, right? His physics of swords and where they, you know, their nodes of vibration are and where their points of rotation are and stuff. I think his work is brilliant about that stuff, but I think he also maybe overstates how much this stuff works on a lot of weapons, right? So like our Duke Verbino sword, a single-handed sword. I remember when I brought it to Longpoint last time, what's his name? The guy who is the pro gauntlet guy, Martin? Maybe, I don't know, Swedish dude, right? Whatever. Anyways, he had it. He's like, this sword's awesome. Oh, I love it. And then he, you know, did the point of rotation thing. He's like, oh, but the point of rotation is off the tip. It's not even on the sword. Or like, you know, I was like, yeah, that's one of the things that makes that one awesome. And it's not always the case that you take a compass and lay it out geometrically. I have no doubt that a bunch of master smiths did, and that it's a really good way to make sure you're making a good sword, but it's not the only way to make a good sword, right? So sometimes long points are at the tip, or long swords are at the tip. Sometimes they're back a little more. I think that it's an interesting idea, and it sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, I know that, just to say really quickly, I remember also hearing that like single-handed swords don't want to rotate at the tip because they're often sieging swords. So you're often, like in sword and buckler, you're striking, and when you're winding and you want your tip to go down. You don't want your tip to stay on. You want your tip to go around your opponent's shield. So they were saying like single-handed swords and rapiers can be sieging swords where you're trying to get a line and then put your tip into it and stab the person. Whereas long swords tended not to do that.
Sure.
But that's, not necessarily true or false. Yeah.
Sure. No, I think it's an interesting way to try and think through those things. And it'd be interesting to talk about it a little more after. Pretty cool.
Nathan, I've got a question. So far we've been approaching kind of the evaluation of swords from a modern context, right? Like we take all the tools of physics and we're thinking, okay, like let's break this down as a physical object. Do we have sources that in the period where they talk about like how should I evaluate a sword? You know, some of them they discuss length, right? But they don't really talk much else. So one thing I've been, curious about is why doesn't anyone tell me what makes a good sword? Like that's consistent or contemporaneous with the fencing system that I'm in.
Yeah, so not my area of expertise. There are at least some points where, I'm trying to remember what Craig was telling me, an anecdote the other day from the sagas or something about, I'm not sure.
Okay.
we'd have to look. And
yeah,
I think that people were clearly judging what was a good sword or not. Kind of the probable plagiarization of Ulfbert or Eaglery, or of like this sword. You can see what it says on it. Andrea Ferreira on it.
Yeah.
These kinds of names that seem to be tokens of quality.
Yeah.
It wasn't actually made by Ferreira. Like, I don't think Ferreira was still alive when this sword was made. Probably not. Right? But it says his name on it. It says his name
Matthew
on it.
offers
So it's kind of branded?
Oh yeah, Monty. Yeah, he also discusses a
Yeah.
little bit of the construction of the hilt as well. But
Mhm.
like part of me is wondering, like this, if there's this scenario where a modern person goes back in time and is like, oh yeah, where's the distal taper? And the guy's like, I don't know, it's made by this good guild maker, so I know it's good.
Yeah.
Full stop. Like that means it's a good sword. And then look, I painted it fancy.
Yeah. I think that that's probably the case. I think that people picked up something that felt good, and they probably flexed it a little bit if it was flexy, right? Make sure it didn't bend. Although a lot of people who were fighting were issued arms.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, if you were just a fighting man, you got issued from the armory, and you fought with what you were given. And the smiths that, when these swords were made, right, you had people who mostly made blades, and then you had people who mostly made hilts and put them together. And so sword makers in Passau or in Solingen
Right.
would essentially take big barrels, pack them full of bare blades, and then ship them to England or ship them to France. When they got there, you'd sort them out. Someone would decide which ones were fancier, which were less fancy, and then you build them out.
Got it.
Make them. So it was really an industrial workshop process, contrary to video games.
Not the village blacksmith, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that basket hilt a single-edged?
Yep, it's a back sword.
Okay.
Yeah, so these kinds of basket hilts, there were two main differentiations based on blade shape. So a broadsword, especially in Scottish parlance, was sharp on both edges. And a back sword, like this one, is more like a later saber. So it's only sharp on the front edge and it's thicker on the back, although this does have a false edge up here at the point. Again, this thing is so thin and so fine. So if any of you fight single stick, right, this is the kind of sword that the single stick tradition, parts of it, right, part of it are just about clubbering each other at Highland fairs, but the part that's actually the martial practice of single stick is a way to train to fight with this sword, right? And with that super fine point, this thing is a 3-foot-long razor blade, right? So Ferreira, right, the legend around Ferreira is that essentially he was brought from probably Italy to Scotland to teach Scottish smiths how to make fine, flexible, laminated blades. There's actually no evidence that there were really very many Scottish smiths. Don't tell Paul MacDonald I said that. And it, he certainly seems to have been there, but there's a big legend that built up around him. So the name Andrea Ferreira actually became like the real McCoy. It was just something that signaled quality. Although this is a very high quality back sword. You see this iconic conical pommel on here and a fancy and beautiful basket. One of the things to note on real basket hilts is that your hand barely fits inside the basket, right? It's a nice tight fits. Most modern reproductions have way too big a basket in them, and you can really lock your hand down into this. This has probably the original ray skin grip. So this sword is, boy, I would say it's early 18th century, probably. You think, Dale? Or was it late 17th?
God, I don't remember.
On the spot, just like I put myself on the spot. It's sometime around 1700, maybe 1680 to 1720. It also really coolly has a spacer made of antler in there, inside of it, on the grip, which is pretty cool. When we think of swords, I think from the early modern period like this, the modern period, we tend to just think of these cavalry sabers, right, which have a super thick back, really rigid, and they're quite heavy, in part because those were just mass produced, right? There's tons of those swords left from Civil War period right up through even World War I. But again, they can kind of mislead us about the variety of swords that existed and how fine these things were. The last one I want to show you is one of my very favorite swords in the whole collection. So this is a civilian hanger. It has an antler grip, awesomely. I don't know if you can see it, but it says Henkels on it. Like the,
Cool.
Is it still under warranty? Can you
exactly
actually
still
up, yeah.
which, you know, is a probably wasn't the company, it's just the place where it was made, but where there's still this knife making tradition, right? Henkel's chef knives are super famous. So this thing, when you hold it, completely locks in your hand, and your thumb fits right under this turned back section of the guard.
Okay,
And
what? Okay.
the shape of the grip just perfectly fits the hand. It's asymmetrical. Here, there are 2 cuts in it, which Ewart liked to fantasize that, you know, whoever had the sword was riding through the Black Forest and was set upon by highwaymen who attempted to chop him, but it was still in his scabbard, and so they chopped the handle of the blade twice or something. There's no evidence for that at all. But it's a cool story, and the sword has complex fullers in it. Right? It goes from 2 to 3 to 2 again. So we come out toward this widening point with this sharp false edge, and this thing, again, is utterly matte. It's so lightweight and so fast. It's just fantastic. So that's the last sword I wanted to show you, but I want to, just before we wrap up, I'd like to give Dale maybe 5 minutes just to explain the 3D modeling project
Sure.
That we're doing.
I have about 5 minutes and then I have to go teach, so that'd be good.
Perfect.
That sword actually, I think, might be the thinnest one we have in the collection. I still haven't taken the measurement off it, but out towards the tip where it has those 2 fullers, it feels like your fingers are just going to meet. Yeah, so I'm Dale Utt. I'm with the Oakeshott as well, and on a whim several years ago, I asked them if I could possibly take some of the pieces and do some experiments with photogrammetry, completely randomly. Actually had some success with it, and then later decided that was going to become my business. So now I run a business doing 3D modeling for museums. And this has been a project that has been in the works for quite a while, and is basically just trying to make to expand on the Ewart Oakeshott's original goals, but now in terms of like the digital age. So especially now, since we're in the middle of lockdown, it's become super apparent that not everyone is going to be able to come and see the pieces in person. And we want to try and be able to replicate the experience of seeing them face to face as best as we possibly could. And this is one of the ways I think that we can actually do that. It also has a bunch of other benefits. Being able to record them is a really nice way to be able to keep track of corrosion, or to be able to look at fine details. And I mean, just for the average person outside of the collection and who don't get to go to these events, you're not stuck looking at a 2D image anymore. If you've ever wondered what the inside of the hilt looks like, so you want to go in and see like what's right up underneath, no one's crazy enough to take those pictures and put them onto like a museum's website. You get like 2 or 3 really well composed shots, and then you're like, what does the back side of the sword look like? You only showed me one side. So ideally, this is going to eliminate that and allow people to get a much better idea of what the objects themselves look like. And while we're limiting ourselves right now to just the 3D models, I personally think that there's a lot of possibility for expansion and doing a bunch of other interesting things, including adding animation. I would really like to start incorporating a little bit of mocap so that we can start showing like what these weapons look like in motion. Because right now they're still kind of static. So that might still be a year or two out, but hopefully that's where I want to go with it.
It's awesome. And Dale is actually a rocket scientist, so it does take a rocket scientist to do it. And
yeah, I was in aerospace engineering before, and then decided that this would be more fun.
Yeah.
If less lucrative. Yeah.
And these are, I mean, I would say arguably the finest 3D models in the world of swords.
Yeah, I've seen people try, but that's the nice thing about being specialized is you get really good at, doing specific things.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to take this around to other collections as well. I've already got leads in a couple of places.
Awesome. So check
Hopefully
out those models. We have a Patreon campaign that helps support. It just pays the rent, and if there's ever extra money, we give Dale some. I think that happened once.
Yeah, it happened once.
For making these models. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. We're supposed to end 7 minutes ago or something. Is that right? Or...
It's such a soft stop because the conversations happen and questions are so unpredictable. Really, it's just to make sure that there's enough content to discuss.
Okay, cool. So I'm happy to take...
Which I knew was not going to be an issue with it.
Yes. I'm happy to take questions and we can have some...
Charles, you had one way back in the beginning.
Oh, well, mine's like now multi-part. As this whole thing's been going on, it's just been expanding. All right, okay. So you mentioned evolution, and then I actually kind of predicted you would have something interesting to say about Bashford Dean's evolution charts. So this is like a multi-part question, but the first one is, what did Oakeshott have to say about that mentality? So for those of you who don't know, some of you have seen like a chart that implies an evolution of swords. It gets the rounds, but it's just not good. But I'm just wanted to ask Nathan, what do you think Oakeshott's opinion of that was? What is your opinion of it? And also, what is the broader commentary that they're making about the culture at the time? Is that kind of is that statement indicative of the broader cultural statement that he's making?
Sure.
That's part one.
Okay, let me talk about part one.
Yeah.
So Bashford Dean was the curator, or he was in charge of European arms and armor at the Met, and he assembled a bunch of the collection there in New York. And he was really influential in trying to understand these things early on. So Dean is writing in like the 20s.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So he's trying to make this evolutionary chart that shows how these different styles of swords developed, right? Starting with basically Bronze Age stuff or Viking stuff. It depends which chart you're looking at, and leading out to complex hilts in all of these kind of branching pathways, right? Now, he's trying to do that because the scientific theory of the time that had the most purchase in the humanities and social sciences was Darwinism, right? So Dean wasn't the only person trying to use evolutionary thought to explain non-evolutionary mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You had sociologists who were racial supremacists that were engaging in eugenics that were doing it. You had all kinds of art historians, you had politicians, all of these folks, anthropologists, right, were using these kinds of evolutionary ideas to try and explain diversity in the present, right? That things started out simple and got complex. Oakeshott, I think that eventually he was more skeptical of these things. And I think that he thought that they weren't super empirical because it was so hard to date swords, right? And because you had them moving all over the place. So part of these evolutionary things is locating areas and places where these designs bloom and then spread out. So anthropologists at the time were all about this evolution and diffusion ideas, right? Which basically, if you watch like Ancient Aliens show on History Channel today, that was like cutting edge social science.
We jokingly went back and watched the first episode recently, and it was so, there were some leaps.
Exactly, right? So Dean is a product of his time, which is not, I don't think that the things were like, I'm not saying he was a eugenicist or something, I have no idea. But he's trying to copy the most exciting philosophical and theoretical things at the time, which Oakeshott was starting from the other end, right? Oakeshott's whole method is to be empirical and to handle and study these individual things rather than trying to make a grand overarching theory that explains where we ended up, right? So the typology isn't explanatory, it's descriptive, right? It's about being able to write a letter to your friend who's a sword collector and be like, there's this sword. This is what it's like. Right? It's a type 15A, but different from these other swords in this way. Right? It's a shorthand for description rather than an analytical tool for trying to say where it came from and where it went. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So, well, that's great. And then the second part is actually kind of looking at it from the modern perspective, right? Because if I think of Oakeshott as making kind of a, maybe not a cultural statement, but just kind of a reply to kind of the scientific or perhaps colonial methods from before, now there's a modern mindset that looks at the past as this idealized state and not as kind of a stepping stone towards modernity. Right. And so do you think, do you have thoughts on this? You kind of touched on that before.
I mean, yeah, I think, right, we've kind of done this 180, like you just, right? Instead of thinking that they're barbarous, now we think that everyone must have been an engineer or something, right? That everything must have had a reason. And it's a mix, right? So much of it was just fashion. So much was fashion, right? So like Flamberge, flamed blades. Right? There's always debates pop up like, did having a curvy blade give you an advantage in the bind? It's like, I don't know, maybe for half a second or something, because it looked cool. Right? That's why people wanted it. It was bling. And I don't think we should overlook the way that people in the past were like venal, ego-obsessed, kind of fashion plates, just like people now. They just had swords too. Some of them are super deep thinkers about all kinds of stuff. Some of them worked just like today. And I don't want to be presentist about it, right? When I say just like today, it was way different than today. Yeah. But we had the same variety of motivations and expectations that were going on that influenced weapon design, sword design. Right? Like if you were an archaeologist in 500 years looking back at America and you see all of these AR-15s like super modded out in all of these areas around the country, right? You're going to be like, oh, wow, these guys, this fighting is so dangerous. You needed 25 round clips, you needed night vision, you needed all this stuff. Like, no one needs it. It's because they think it's cool. Right?
You joke, but that was actually a joke website that.
Oh really?
I had this idea of HEMA 2500 where people looked back on images of the present day and tried to interpret them in the same kind of shallow and utilitarian way that they looked at, that people nowadays look at kind of the 15th century.
Sure. I think it's awesome, and I'd look at it a lot.
Yeah. Anyways, that's all I have for now. I'll be back with more.
Cool. Thanks, Charles.
I have a question about, like, I don't know if you studied armor much, but I remember that when I saw a gauntlet of yours that you had at Longpoint when you were showing some of the swords. Mm-hmm. And I guess the first digression is to comment on the coolness of the swords. I feel like the toes of armor are the same way, like just fashion. It's like, what's fashionable? Are your armor toes going to be sharp or square? Well, what's fashionable nowadays?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. And sometimes even probably fashionable to the detriment of your safety. Right?
Yeah.
I remember
So-
that.
Fashion is pain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like 2 years ago at Sword Squatch, someone, I can't remember who it was teaching a rapier or small sword class where everyone was wearing high heels,
Yeah.
which I think is an awesome social experiment. Right?
But a friend of mine actually was in that, and he was saying that they tell you to put your weight on your heels when you're doing small sword, but when you put your weight on your heels in flat shoes, it doesn't work. So they were looking at the time frame, and they were saying that historically, the time frame, you wore slight heels, you wore high heels.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you put your weight on your heels when you're doing small sword in like a pair of 3 or 4 inch heels, the balance is perfect. So
Sure.
it's, yeah, but
That's awesome. It's a great example.
yeah, but I guess my question is with gauntlets, there's been a constant debate as to how you hold the longsword, blah, blah, blah. How do you hold the longsword?
Mm-hmm.
This is, of course, armored versus unarmored, but I would assume some gauntlets mimic this. I remember the gauntlet you had that I couldn't try on was very hammer fisty. Like it didn't really seem like you could take that long grip where your fingers, like your pointer finger was in front of your pinky. It looked like you were stuck in a very like square grip.
Sure. So those were the Hans Pruner gauntlets. So they're kind of high Gothic ones. They're more flexible than you would think. And if I'm thinking of the right ones, they come down to about here and don't have the fingers on them, which were probably, if there were fingers, they were little plates connected to the glove instead of to the rest of the gauntlet.
Yeah.
I think you could probably hold it out like that, but I think that those gauntlets were probably mostly not made for sword fighting. They were probably, or if you were using a sword, you were probably mounted
Okay.
most of the time. So with those gauntlets, I kind of assumed that you would be wielding a polearm or a spear most.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Howdy, Nathan.
Howdy. Hey, Henry.
Yes, it's been a while. I mean, other than like just commenting on the Arms and Armor page. So
exactly. It's so nice to have like Facebook friends and sword friends.
Well, we were at WMAW, so there's photographic evidence of that.
Exactly.
I have a practical question. I'm just curious from a curatorial point of view with these swords. What do you use as a coating for preservative purposes? Because they're metal. You've got to have something to keep them, keep the 12th century sword from not looking like a 12th century sword that's been in the ground for a while. So what do you guys kind of use as your preservative stuff?
Sure. So we use an industrial anti-rust agent made by Zepp that is really good at not leaving a buildup film on it. So we have used Renaissance wax at times in the past, but it seems to build up a little bit more and make it kind of hard to clean on them. So with this Zepp, which essentially evaporates and leaves a very fine film on it, kind of more like WD-40, it's easy to replace after it's been touched. So I think if we weren't touching these swords a bunch, we just Renaissance wax them and put them in the case. But this industrial agent seems to work okay, as long as you don't read the industrial safety data sheet about how it will like make your children mutants.
You just have to have it accessible in case anyone has questions. That's what OSHA says.
And it also helps when like I hand these out and I say, nobody lick this sword, not only because it's bad for history, but because you'll get poisoned.
There you go.
That always helps, yes. Well, and also if you don't do it correctly, you can find out that the old sword still has an edge, which is not a great way to.
For sure.
Yeah. So
Craig, the manager at Arms and Armory, he has a good story about drinking with someone at WMAW before it was called WMAW, whatever it was back then. W. Mac or something, who at like 2 a.m. was trying to pay him first $100, then $200, then $500 to cut him with a 500-year-old sword from the Oakeshott collection. It's like, I'm not going to cut you with a sword. I have a scar.
This touches on something some months back, maybe even a year or so back. And I think you guys had mentioned initially, but it was about accidents in sword making where people occasionally get stabbed and injured. And I had mentioned that it would actually, you could probably get a marketing thing by just marketing the occasional sword going, this sword has tasted human blood. People would pay extra for that stuff.
Oh, it's true, but you don't know if it's blessed or cursed.
That's, mileage may vary.
Exactly. Yes, it happens all the time. When I was shipping back a bunch of swords from CombatCon, so we put them in a box and shipped them from FedEx. And I was, carefully packing them in the box, and the manager at FedEx came out and like pushed them down into the box. I was like, no. It was gross. He got stabbed. It didn't go through, but he got a pretty good stab. So I told him that he got to name the sword after that. So he named it Little Prick.
With a story a couple of years ago at one of the DC HEMAs, we had, I think it was an Albion. It was I forgot the type of Albion, but it's one of their it's a single hander. It's made on medieval, and it's basically a 3-foot razor blade.
Sure.
And so it comes out of the package and it's got that thin cardboard wrap around it. And Jake Norwood got it. He said, "Cool," and he grabbed it. And he was talking to somebody, so he wasn't quite paying attention. So he pulled with a little too much pressure. It cut through the cardboard and cut into his finger.
Ugh.
And ever since that particular sword, which I think is one of the club swords, still we just used to joke that it has a taste for blood.
Totally.
It's thirsty. So
yeah, and that's never pull off that paper like this. Grab the flats.
But like I was mentioning to with the Moon brand and all these really thin swords. But again, if you're dealing in a lightly, in a town environment or in a light bandits or something, it's because people, unless you've done test cutting, you tend to forget how really easy it is and scary it is to cut things with swords. It's so easy. It's frightening.
Yeah, exactly. And the thinner they are, the more terrifying, right? So I don't know if you guys saw the video of where I was testing our Leeds Castle sword, like our new 18C. And so it's the longest and the lightest of the Alexandria Arsenal swords. So it's just a razor blade. It's terrifying. And Clive, what's his name? Clive from the Park Lane Arms Fair. Anyways, he had written that these swords, there's no way you could thrust with them because they're too flexible. Right. So I was doing a test where I was thrusting through a spec heavy jacket.
I saw that.
It just goes straight through, right? But then chopping through that gambeson with that thin sword. So 2 layers of the spec heavy gambeson on top of a pumpkin.
Yeah.
It just, with no resistance, just cut straight through it. And it just made me think about cloth armor in totally different ways and these thin swords. And I tried to cut it with a thicker bladed normal longsword. And the gambeson was okay protection against, these swords that are much thicker. So it totally depends what you're trying to kill.
Well, and you have to think about the poor man's armor, which jack chains and stuff, which just covered the critical bits you might expect to get hit at.
Yeah.
With something really choppy if you're wearing a gambeson. It's just enough metal to keep you from losing your arm.
Yeah, exactly.
And one last thing, I'll let you go. But we had done, this is now with the Arms and Armor Alexandria sword, probably about 3-4 years ago. But we'd been doing cutting, and we had a lot of leftover bits of tatami. So we were playing a game, which one does with sword. But we had chunks of tatami. We would toss them in the air, and the person with the sword would catch it. The Alexandria, once it hit the point, the tatami chunk would cut itself in half, traveling down the point on its own weight.
Yeah.
Which, those swords are extremely frightening as human fillet devices. So anything of that Alexandria, that design category, that you guys have, and that is just I look at it and go, it's like, no, don't point that thing at me.
They are terrifying.
Yes. So
Can confirm, filleted my fingertip with an Alexandria design.
tasted blood. There we go.
Ugh. Yeah.
Hey, Nathan, this is John Dowdle. A couple of quick questions. The first one would be, did Oakeshott ever do much research on like Messers, but especially Falchons? I mean, he was English. I know the Messer was more of a German, background, but Falchons were, big with at certain times with the French and the English. And probably the second thing, if you would, next time you see Craig, tell him he still owes me a Sparthax, if you would.
Totally will tell him that. I'll tell him tomorrow. Yeah, so Oakeshott's main focus was on two-edged swords, right? So symmetrical medieval swords. He did write a little bit about, falchions and messers and stuff. If I recall, in the Archaeology of Weapons, I think he talks about them. But they definitely weren't his main focus. So those kinds of single-edged swords mostly fall outside of his typology. People who have been studying them a little more these days are mostly people who are into kind of the Messer and Dusak stuff, but I'm not aware of actually a good kind of in-depth, kind of scientific study of them, which doesn't mean that someone may well have done it, but I'm not aware of one in English.
Well, I know that there's a guy named Elmsley that came out recently with a typology of, which is a good graphic, but I haven't seen a lot of background research. I mean, I like Messer and the Falchon along as well, but
yeah,
I was just curious, and but I do know that he did come out with a very good graphic. I have used that actually in a couple of presentations. So,
sure.
But
Elmsley, is that his name?
I think so. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, James Elmsley. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I haven't read that yet, or looked at it. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I thought he did good thing with the graphic. I just haven't seen much research behind it yet.
Sure. Yeah.
How
hey, thank you.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Sorry. How hard is it to grind the bevels on the Alexandria sword? Yeah.
So the Arsenal one, the Leeds Castle one. So the Alexandria is an Albion.
Yeah.
But those ones, it's really tough. It's super thin out there, and the wider a blade is, the harder it is to get a nice flat facet all the way across that goes straight down to the edge. So it's actually turned out to be a giant pain in the butt. And our blade grinding guy, Joe, kind of curses me for insisting that we make one like that. But it's okay, because I'm going to make him hate me more when I make us do Moonbrand, hopefully next year. That thing is horrifying to grind, but it'll be worth it.
Yeah, when I saw that those were hand ground, and I know that Albion does theirs with a machine. When I saw yours was like hand ground, I was like, Jesus Christ, that's an undertaking.
It is a lot of work. And so the main difference is and I'm Sigmund. Mike Sigmund is a good buddy of mine, and Albion makes fantastic swords. We do have some differences in production. So they use a CNC machine to do a lot more of the blade shape. And we do a lot more of it by hand, which is mostly because we don't know how to use a CNC machine. And so they've kind of, when they set up Albion, they've got, 16, 18 folks, and they set it up really as kind of a light industrial factory. And our shop is really a workshop. So we've got 6 guys in the basement, and I'm the newest. So the average amount of time that someone's been working at Arms and Armor is about 25 years. And 2 of the guys actually live in the building that Arms and Armor is in, and have just been making swords forever, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's definitely a different thing. And that's why we can make a lot of custom work. So all of our guys, I'm going into advertisement mode for a few minutes, but all of our guys have handled dozens and dozens of original swords. And if they're making a sword, like we have a commission, you know, they can come down the hall to the Oakeshott room and pick up a 16th century backsword or a 15th century longsword and hold it and think about it for a minute while they're making it reproduction. So it's a super benefit to us to be able to do that. So thank you, Ewart, for sending your stuff to America.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
For
maybe
collecting them in the first place.
Oh, I know, my God, and for doing all the writing he did. So I think we should probably do one more question. I told my wife I'd be home soon, so I should
Can I
probably.
go? It's John Dersh. I'd like to throw one last one, please.
Sure, yeah.
Burn with this one. So we just got done going through the entire Zettel as a club during the pandemic here, and a recurring theme was the translation of the word when he binds upon you. And I have this thesis I'm building that binding really infers that when blades, the metal actually locks in, because the impact of the blades, for some reason, how you hit causes those two blades to catch in each other. And I'm going to say something, caveat, do not do this at home, kids. We did this a while ago with the really crappy cold steel Italian longswords, where we were swinging them and, hitting the edge on edge, and we were finding ourselves catching, with very mild steel, and kept feeling those blade edges just hit each other like mushy butter and getting locked in. And I say this because if you look at the plays in the Zettel where they explicitly call out the binding of the action, and you look at what you're supposed to do after that binding, those do not translate very well with our very slick, slippery modern fetters that you said, are not great facsimiles of what they're using to fight. And
Zukin especially, that's the play that comes to mind immediately.
Right. The one we were really going over was the play where essentially you both bind in, and then you reach with your left hand, inverted thumb down, put your thumb on your side of the X, your fingers on the far side of the X, drive your pommel through up over the opponent's forearm, and then yank back and rip both swords away. And I can do this slow motion with a willing partner, but in real life with the modern fetters, no way. Yeah. With a thick leather glove and a pair of sharp swords and my life on the line, and knowing that I had bound my opponent because we had locked in blades, I would pull out. So my question is, long drum roll, question is, in your experience with playing with all these incredible pieces of metal, particularly the long swords, do you have any thoughts on the construction of the longsword that would give any credence to this thesis that the term bind indicated a moment where, because of the construction of the sword, because of the materials they used at the time, not our modern ones, not our modern, 1095 that we stamp out and heat treat and, have amazing steels. I'm talking about the material of the time, the contemporary material when the Zettel was written. Does the thesis hold any water at all that the material would cause a bind that when you cut at each other, you find yourselves stuck?
I think so. And actually, so slight digression, but it's toward this. So we're starting an Oakeshott Visiting Fellows program. And the first two people who were supposed to come this year during COVID were Adam Franti and Jess Finley. We're both going to be visiting for, a week or something and doing some research on the collection. And Jess's research that she wants to do is about wear marks on sharp swords. So she's been doing with Bob Charette a bunch of sharp work, edge on edge, doing just the kind of thing that you're talking about. And so you might want to talk to her, but she was going to come and examine swords in the collection, and then we were going to make, just take some arms and armor swords and chop the hell out of them on each other to see how it turns out. And I think you're right. So absolutely, right? These swords, the steel isn't so hard that it will mostly chip when they hit, right? If you took two modern chef knives and smack them together,
Yeah. So
you're likely to break those.
I'm sorry, you're saying the modern steel will be more likely to chip, as opposed to the other steel will be more likely to, bind in.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we see, like on Moonbrand, there are actually a bunch of places where it looks like there are wedges taken out and then it's resharpened. And so they go from like a V to a U. Right? Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not an inclination to go buy a pair of Albions and whack into because I don't think that they'll do this. First and foremost because they're expensive as hell, and I don't feel like throwing $2,000 down the drain and risk breaking in. More so, risk a catastrophic event where somebody gets actually skewered. We only did with the cold steels because you could do this slowly and still have these things bind in because the steel was so mild. And so now my next question then is, this sounds like a next great Zoom session. If Jess comes by and Bob Schreck come by, we all know Bob, and they're very fastidious and they're very exacting in what they do. And if they could be convinced to allow this to be a Zoom session or something that was remotely live, or maybe after they've had a chance to go over some things, you would probably have a massive turnout. I know a lot of people would like to see that. So just throwing that out there, if that could be put together, that'd be awesome.
Sure, that's a great idea. And so we do quarterly lectures here with various folks, and obviously it's been kind of on hold this year, but I think there's no reason we couldn't stream it live when Jess comes and everything. That'd be super fun. And I'm super excited to get to smash some sharp swords together. And the cold steels are probably pretty good for that. I mean, so Craig here has done research on historical sword hardness, and a lot of them are, I mean, the hardness varies a lot down the blade on these historical pieces, but the 40 Rockwell kind of hardness is probably pretty common, up to like 55 tops.
Is that something he's cataloging? That'd be a great catalog to research.
Yeah, he had written an article about it on My Armory like 15 years ago. And mostly he's been doing other stuff. His wife keeps having kids.
Sorry, I probably shouldn't have laughed.
If only there's something sharp you could use, to stop that.
I know.
Carefully.
Exactly.
Has anyone ever commissioned you to make a sword, and probably for experimental purposes, but actually trying to make it period steel? That is, actually finding a piece of bloomery steel, making it, and doing the best of your, eyeballing, but knowing it's probably going to have inclusions and stuff in it. Because the thing you hear about period swords often is sometimes they break in dire situations when you don't want them. And accounts, and that's and so I'm just curious, because that goes back to his binding experiments, in that if you make something with what is equivalent to the mild steel of the period. I'm just curious.
So a little bit. So mostly when we've done things like that, so Rick Furr in Michigan, who was like, if you remember that Secrets of the Viking Sword Nova. So Rick is the smith who did that up in Michigan. He's buddies with us. So I actually have a chunk of pattern welded steel that he sent us the other day. So we tend to use stuff from him. So we haven't done, we do forge blades occasionally, but mostly what we're doing is all steel is forged, right? The steel mill forges it. And then, so we grind it precisely because modern steel is so much more homogeneous and consistent.
Oh, yeah, totally. I totally get that. I was just thinking from purely, shall we say, experimental archaeology perspective.
Yeah, so if we were going to, it'd be fun. Like, Rick would just totally send us stuff. So that would be a cool thing to propose, and I think it'd be really fun.
Because I forgot there's some bunch of guys out in Sweden who I think actually have been doing sword making, but they literally went and made by hand their own tools and their own things. So all, the tools are handmade to period specs in a workshop that is made to period specs, who make things to period specs. So, and I think they even have like a stream-driven water hammer that they, so yeah, that kind of thing. But that's kind of taking it to one extreme. But again, I'd always thought just to make a couple of swords out of bloomery steel
Yeah.
and use them. What they've done with the bronze making, some of the bronze making people have done some really cool things. But again, and then just test them again, what we're talking about, binding in that, because I have to say, modern steel is magic. It is wonderful stuff.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
We've taken part of that randomness out of, because even the best made swords sometimes, there's an inclusion. Well, it happens with modern swords, but a whole lot less. So
absolutely. Yeah. So Rick, if you're interested, Rick Furr actually does a week-long class in the summers called Dirt to Dagger. And where he actually came to Minnesota and got iron ore. So big iron, the iron range in Minnesota makes all the iron ore, right? And so he bought like a pickup truck load of iron ore. It's in his yard covered by a tarp. And so for this camp, you build a bloomery furnace, smelt the ore down, and then over the course of a week, you make a dagger out of it. And I've always wanted to do it. It sounds awesome.
Right. I'm like, field trip is in order at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
I've done some really basic blacksmithing. Like I've made a candelabra, so I'm not going to complete, but I would like to do some blade making actually. So be it knives or something, but that, again.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's super fun. Well, guys, I should roll here, but thank you so much. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed seeing and talking with all of you, and I can't wait till we can see each other in person at some point.
I know, I'm so excited, but thank you again so much for agreeing to do this. And John, thank you for tracking Nick down so we could like make this happen.
Sweet.
Right. The swords were gorgeous. The talk was super educational. I have pages and pages of notes.
Excellent.
Go home, go see your wife. Thanks again.
Send me an email or anything if you have questions. I'm happy to correspond. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Night.
See you.